Every one of these logos represents a company that was, at some point, considered brilliant. Not lucky, not reckless, brilliant. Run by people with decades of experience, rooms full of lawyers and spreadsheets that were checked and rechecked before anyone signed anything. And yet, 10 different times, in 10 completely different industries, those same brilliant people watched a fortune slip through their fingers. Not because they were cheated, not because they were unlucky, because they made a call that felt completely reasonable in the moment and turned out to be catastrophic in hindsight. This isn't a list of villains. It's a list of people who trusted the wrong instinct at exactly the wrong time. And once you see the pattern connecting all 10 of them, you'll start noticing it everywhere else too. Let's start with the strangest one, because it didn't end in a boardroom. It ended on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. In 2011, Hewlett-Packard bought a British software company called Autonomy for $11.1 billion. HP's CEO at the time, Leo Apotheker, wanted to transform the company from a hardware business into a software giant. Within a year, HP wrote off $8.8 billion of that purchase. They accused Autonomy's leadership of inflating the numbers before the sale. Autonomy's founder, a man named Mike Lynch, spent the next 13 years fighting that accusation. He was extradited to the United States. He stood trial. Prosecutors called him one of the biggest fraudsters in Silicon Valley history. And in June of 2024, a San Francisco jury acquitted him completely, all 15 charges. Lynch walked out of that courtroom a free man, after over a decade of his name being dragged through the mud. 2 months later, he chartered a yacht called the Bayesian to celebrate with his family and the lawyers who had defended him. On August 19, 2024, during a sudden and violent storm off the coast of Sicily, that yacht sank in minutes. Lynch drowned. So did his 18-year-old daughter and 5 other people on board, including one of his own defense attorneys. Think about the sheer scale of that story for a second. A deal worth $11 billion, a legal battle that lasted 13 years, a courtroom victory, and then, almost immediately, tragedy at sea. HP never got its money back, and the man they blamed never got his reputation fully back either. He just ran out of time. It's one of the strangest final chapters in corporate history, and most people who talk about the HP Autonomy deal don't even know what happened. Now let's go back further to a story that's less tragic but almost as strange, because this one is about a movie nobody believed in. In 1976, a director named George Lucas was renegotiating his contract with 20th Century Fox for a science fiction film the studio didn't fully understand. Fox executives agreed to lower his director's salary. In exchange, Lucas asked for something the studio considered nearly worthless: merchandising rights and control of any sequels, toys, lunchboxes, action figures. Who was going to buy a toy based on a movie about space wizards? Fox signed off without much of a fight. Star Wars was released in May of 1977. Within a year, merchandise sales alone had crossed $100 million. 2 sequels followed, then 3 prequels. Then, decades later, an entire new trilogy, plus spin-offs, TV shows, and theme park lands. In 2012, Disney bought Lucasfilm, including all of it, for just over $4 billion. Fox, the studio that once owned the distribution rights, never owned the empire built on top of them. Here's the detail that makes this story sting a little more. Fox wasn't stupid. They correctly predicted that Star Wars was a financial risk. Sci-fi movies at the time mostly flopped. Their mistake wasn't ignorance. It was assuming that if the movie failed, the merchandising rights they were giving away wouldn't matter anyway. Nobody in that room considered the possibility that the movie would succeed beyond anything Hollywood had seen before. Let's jump industries completely, from movie studios to video game consoles. In 1983, Atari was the undisputed king of the video game industry, pulling in over $1 billion a year. That same year, Atari sat down with a much smaller Japanese company called Nintendo to negotiate US distribution rights for a new console called the Famicom. The deal was close to done. Atari would sell the console across America, and both companies would split the profits. Then a dispute broke out over Donkey Kong, which Atari believed Nintendo had licensed to a rival without permission. Negotiations soured. Trust broke down. The deal collapsed entirely by the end of 1983. That same year, the video game industry crashed so badly that it's still studied in business schools as one of the fastest market collapses in history. Atari, weakened by the crash and without a partner, never fully recovered. Nintendo, meanwhile, regrouped, rebuilt its approach, and launched the console alone in America in 1985 as the Nintendo Entertainment System. It went on to sell more than 60 million units worldwide. It effectively resurrected the entire video game industry by itself. Atari spent the rest of the decade watching an industry it once ruled get rebuilt by a company it almost partnered with. What's fascinating here isn't greed or stupidity, it's timing colliding with pride at the worst possible moment. A single contract dispute at a single meeting ended up deciding who controlled console gaming for the next 20 years. Let's talk about a very different kind of mistake now, one involving music, not machines. In the late 1960s, the Beatles didn't fully control the rights to their own songs. Their publishing company, Northern Songs, was structured in a way that left John Lennon and Paul McCartney owning only about 15% each. In 1969, Northern Songs was put up for sale, and the band scrambled to buy back control of their own catalog. They lost the bidding war to a media executive named Lou Grade. His company acquired the rights to essentially every classic Beatles song you can name. Years passed. In 1985, that catalog came up for sale again. Paul McCartney, who understood the value of music publishing better than almost anyone in the industry, considered buying it. He was outbid by Michael Jackson, who paid roughly $47.5 million for the rights. Jackson later merged those publishing rights into a joint venture with Sony. That created a catalog eventually worth hundreds of millions of dollars, which means for years, some of the most famous songs ever written earned royalties for people who had never written a single note of them. The band that arguably built the modern music industry ended up paying, in a sense, rent on their own legacy. Let's move to streaming, because this next one is more recent and shows the exact same pattern playing out in modern times. In 2019, NBC Universal agreed to hand Disney full operational control of Hulu, even though NBC still owned a third of the platform. It seemed harmless at the time. NBC figured it could sell its remaining stake later, once streaming matured and the price went up. But Disney moved quickly. Disney locked NBC into an agreement guaranteeing Disney the right to buy that remaining stake for a minimum, fixed value, regardless of how large Hulu eventually became. Then the streaming boom hit harder than almost anyone predicted. Hulu's subscriber base soared past 48 million. Meanwhile, NBC launched its own streaming service, Peacock. NBC started pulling its own shows off Hulu, which, ironically, shrank the value of the platform NBC still had to help value for the eventual payout. In November of 2023, Disney bought out NBC's entire remaining stake for $8.6 billion. NBC got a large check. Disney got complete control of one of the biggest streaming platforms in the world. NBC thought it was quietly offloading a side project. Instead, it helped finance the very empire that would come to dominate the market it was trying to compete in. Now, here's a story from the very beginning of the internet boom, back when nobody really understood what streaming video was even for. In 1999, Yahoo bought a company called for $5.7 billion, one of the largest acquisitions of the dot-com era. Streamed sports, radio, and grainy video clips to around 570,000 weekly users, which sounded massive at the time. But most people in 1999 were still using dial-up internet. A single video could take minutes just to start loading. Bandwidth was expensive. Content deals were expensive, and integrating the platform into Yahoo turned out to be far messier than anyone expected. By 2002, was quietly shut down. Its co-founder, Mark Cuban, had already cashed out enough of his Yahoo stock before the dot-com crash to walk away a billionaire. Yahoo, on the other hand, walked away having paid billions of dollars for a technology the internet itself wasn't ready to support yet. Sometimes the problem isn't the idea, it's showing up 8 years before the infrastructure exists to make that idea work. Let's talk about a mistake that happened almost in slow motion, over an entire decade, inside one of the most respected research labs in American history. In December of 1979, Xerox invited a young entrepreneur named Steve Jobs to tour its Palo Alto Research Center. In exchange for early access to buy Apple stock, Xerox showed Jobs technology its own engineers had built years earlier. A graphical interface, a mouse, windows on a screen. Xerox's own executives had largely ignored these inventions because the company saw itself as a copier business, not a computer business. Jobs saw something completely different and brought those ideas back to Apple, where they eventually shaped the Macintosh. When Xerox finally tried to enter the personal computer market on its own, it spent over $20 million developing machines that barely sold. Meanwhile, Apple and Microsoft built entire empires, on top of ideas Xerox's own scientists had invented first and set aside. The company that quite literally invented the modern computer window ended up watching everyone else climb through it. Let's stay in the world of computing a little longer, but jump forward a few decades to a much more recent case. In 2011, Google announced it was buying Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion, calling it a move to protect Android with a stronger patent portfolio. At the time, Motorola was losing over $1 billion a year. Its phones were falling behind Samsung and Apple in almost every category that mattered. Google tried relaunching the brand with new phones, the Moto X and Moto G, but margins stayed thin and competitors kept moving faster. Internally, tensions grew between Motorola's hardware teams and Google's own Android division. In January of 2014, Google sold Motorola to the Chinese company Lenovo for just $2.9 billion, keeping only the patents for itself. More than $9 billion had effectively evaporated in under 3 years. But here's the twist that makes this story different from the others on this list. Google didn't actually need to own a phone company to protect Android. It just needed the patents. And it got those far more cheaply than the sale price suggested. In a strange way, Google's billion-dollar mistake ended up proving that its instincts about Android's real strength were correct all along. Now, let's talk about a company most people don't even remember exists anymore and how it managed to build, then destroy, one of the most iconic characters in animation. In 1928, Walt Disney traveled to New York to renew his contract for a character called Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, the star of his young studio's early cartoons. His distributor, a man named Charles Mintz, informed him that Universal actually owned Oswald completely. Mintz offered to cut Disney's pay significantly if he wanted to keep making the cartoons. When Disney refused, Mintz revealed he had already quietly hired away most of Disney's own animators. Walt left that meeting with no character, no staff, and no leverage at all. On the train ride home, frustrated and running out of money, he began sketching a new character with round ears. That character debuted later that year in a short film called Steamboat Willie. His name, of course, was Mickey Mouse. Oswald stayed at Universal, largely forgotten for decades. Mickey Mouse became the foundation of one of the largest entertainment companies on the planet. Disney technically bought the rights to Oswald back from Universal in 2006, nearly 80 years later, as part of an unrelated trade involving a sportscaster, which means the original mistake took almost a lifetime to even partially correct. And finally, let's close with the story most people already half know, because it happened during a period a lot of us actually remember living through. In 2011, Microsoft, led by CEO Steve Ballmer, announced it was buying Skype for $8.5 billion, the largest acquisition in the company's history at the time. Skype had around 170 million active users. It was losing money every quarter, and its underlying technology was starting to show its age. Microsoft rushed to integrate Skype across Windows, Xbox, and mobile devices, but the transition was rough. Meanwhile, Apple rolled out FaceTime. Google pushed Hangouts. WhatsApp exploded into hundreds of millions of users almost overnight. Skype's once futuristic blue logo started to look dated within just a few years. Quietly, inside Microsoft's own walls, a different product called Teams began absorbing the features that made Skype useful in the first place. By 2017, Teams had swallowed Skype for Business entirely. By the early 2020s, consumer Skype had faded almost completely out of public relevance. Microsoft had spent $8.5 billion acquiring a communication platform, only to eventually replace it with one it built itself. So here we are. 10 companies, 10 industries, 10 decisions that all look defensible on the day they were made. Now let's step back, because there's something worth noticing underneath all of these stories. None of these companies were run by fools. Every single one of them had access to enormous amounts of talent, data, and legal advice. HP had teams of financial analysts reviewing Autonomy's books before the purchase. Fox had studio executives who correctly predicted Star Wars might flop. Atari genuinely believed it was protecting its own intellectual property in the Donkey Kong dispute. Xerox genuinely believed its business was copiers, and copiers only. In almost every case, the decision made sense given what the people in the room already believed about their own industry. That's the uncomfortable part. These weren't failures of intelligence, they were failures of imagination. A company that sees itself as a copier business will always undervalue a computer mouse. A company that sees itself as a video rental chain, or a phone hardware giant, or a movie studio protecting its budget, will always undervalue the thing that doesn't fit its own definition of itself. It's not that these executives couldn't do the math. It's that the math only works if you already believe the premise, and all 10 of these premises turned out to be wrong. There's also a quieter thread running through several of these stories. Control given away almost casually, assuming it would never really matter. Fox assumed merchandising rights were a footnote. NBC assumed a minority stake in Hulu could be cashed out on its own terms later, whenever it felt convenient. The Beatles, without much say in the matter, ended up losing structural control over songs they had personally written. In every one of these cases, somebody assumed the asset being given up was the small print. It rarely stayed small print for long. And then there's Mike Lynch, whose story doesn't fit neatly into any lesson about business strategy at all. His story is a reminder that even when the legal and financial saga finally resolves, life doesn't always give you the neat, satisfying ending you'd expect. Sometimes the deal goes bad, the fight to clear your name takes over a decade, you finally win. The story still doesn't end the way anyone would have written it. That's not really a business lesson. It's just one of the strangest, saddest footnotes in modern corporate history. So what do you actually do with all of this, watching from the outside, decades later, knowing exactly how each story ended? Probably the same thing every executive in every one of these rooms should have asked themselves before signing anything. Not, does this make sense based on what my industry looks like right now? But what if the thing in front of me isn't actually part of my industry at all? What if it's the start of a new one? Because in every single one of these 10 stories, that question was sitting right there in the room. And in every single one of these 10 stories, nobody thought to ask it out loud until it was already far too late. If stories like these interest you, the human side of business decisions gone wrong, not just the numbers on a spreadsheet, there are plenty more worth telling. Stick around for the next one.